3, 2, 1.
Very hard here in Los Angeles right now as an art major, as an artist.
So we're here in City Beach in Perth, Western Australia, and I wanted to ask you, Shaun, about the work Orbital Vanitas that you're about to premiere at the Sundance Festival.
Yeah, it's a work in VR for me that is my first digital work, my first digital animation, my first sort of CGI VFX work, which is exciting for me because I never really thought that I would be interested in doing anything outside of camera functions. To take a work directly to animators, like a concept, and see it rendered was a different challenge. So for me, yeah, it was a challenge or an exciting process because it was completely new, and I'm not sure if I'm good at it, but it was definitely a fun thing to take on with a group of animators. But the work itself is very simple as an idea. It's basically just putting the viewer into a perspective of a wide orbit around the Earth, and then they discover that an object has eclipsed the sun. Some people think that light source over the horizon of the Earth could be the reflection of the reflected moon, and then they realize that this object that's encroaching upon them is actually a human skull. And then around about, I don't know, it's hard to say when it happens, but at a certain point the object starts to move into a relationship with the viewer's body, and they realize that they're in a bit of a scale crisis, and that the skull is actually quite enormous in relation to how we know and perceive our body. And then there's a sequence where people have to be immersed within a kind of landscape of the interior of the skull. And then at the end of the experience, they are sort of shot out of the eye socket of the skull, which in Latin is called the orbit in anatomy. So there's a kind of doubling of the orbit. People spend quite a lot of time in the orbit of the skull itself, but then they're also obviously in orbit around the Earth in terms of what's being represented.
So you've used skulls quite a lot over the years, and with this particular work, where did the idea come from?
I think it's a project that's like a conflation of a lot of ideas, and it's great to be talking about one of the influences here in Perth, because I've been asked to do a public work at Yagan Square, and I completely got off the rails with the brief, and I started thinking along very inappropriate lines for that public commission, because Yagan Square obviously takes its name from a very famous community leader and a warrior, Yagan, who was executed. His head was, decapitated, taken over to the UK, and then that head was just recently repatriated. And I started getting quite obsessed with the abject nature of Yagan's head and the reports of the skin shrinking. And before it was actually given a very respectful ceremonial burial here in Perth, there was quite a lot of the reports of the physical condition of Yagan's head, and I saw that as a form of vanitas within the traditional Western art. So, and then also I then connected that to the history of the City of Lights here in Perth. So you've got John Glenn's Friendship 7 mission, which is also in a Mercury Atlas 6 spacecraft rather. In 1962, when the whole city stuck its lights on so John Glenn could see Perth during those 3 historic orbits around Earth. And so basically I took an obsession with Yagan's head and his skull and connected it to John Glenn's Friendship 7 mission in 62, and that became a kind of composite for what happens with Orbital Vanitas. But then also I was really interested in a very well-known Caravaggio painting called Saint Jerome Writing, which was from 1605, 1606. And it's a very interesting work because that is definitely a very traditional example of vanitas within the Italian Renaissance. But it's a great painting because you see Saint Jerome, who's in a very senior moment. he's just at a senior stage rather of his life. He's almost about to tip over into death, where the skull in the opposite side of the composition is kind of almost looking at him, and a lot has been written about what happens between St. Jerome's head and his skull, and on opposite ends of the kind of picture plane. It's a very compelling image, but again, St. Jerome has this very faint sort of halo, and I looked at the skull that was on St. Jerome's desk, and then I also just stuck the skull into what I saw was the kind of orbit of the halo. The halo looked like it could be a kind of an orbit path of the International Space Station or shuttle or Apollo missions or whatever. So it's basically just kind of formally reorganizing the painting, and then maybe also kind of coming up with some sort of weird conceptual collage between Perth as a city of lights and a NASA mission. But there was other influences as well, but they're probably the two main kind of coordinates that got me to wanting to put a skull into space. But maybe being inside the skull came from like an experiment that took place in 2009. I did these kinetic sculptures which I called Endoscopic Vanitas, where I sort of tried to creatively misuse some medical technology, or the endoscope, and I put the endoscope into the spinal hole or the foramen magnum of the skull, and I worked with this guy called Lee Russell, who's this incredible engineer, to basically build a skull rotisserie, and the skull would slowly orbit actually, and it was in a very slow orbit, and the endoscope gave you a view of the interior of the skull that was really quite abstract. And people would tell me that they would look at the screen of this sculpture, so you'd have a screen and then you'd have the physical skull behind the screen, the endoscope in the skull, and the endoscope giving you a live feed to the screen. So people would see the screen first, they'd be met with a fairly abstract sort of image sequence of these very slowly scrolling forms that may or may not have looked like a limestone cave or some sort of moon terrain or something, but then they get a sidelong glance of that kinetic sculpture and see that the source was actually the interior of the skull. So that was definitely moving towards this idea of privileging the interior of this form that we've known since time immemorable.
This is, I think, your third completed VR work?
Yeah, number 3.
And where do you see, because they've been quite different, each of the 3 pieces has been quite different. Where do you see VR going in terms of your own practice, and then maybe more broadly in art context?
Well, if I can continue on this strategy, it's just going to continue to fragment me into a very unfocused sort of scenario, because I just keep making very different works. But maybe I like the idea that I'm not really trying to hold to any signature style, or I'm just seeing it as a platform for experimentation. So it's like I'm not even really sure what the next work will be. Like, I mean, I'm really interested in making a kind of character study of a friend of mine, which I'm thinking is, I'm going to pitch it as a sort of anti-Islamophobic skate video. Yeah, because she's a really fantastic skateboarder, and she has she observes the Islamic faith, and she's a part of a Muslim skate crew named Chadni, and she's basically in East London, but she's never been to Dhaka, Bangladesh, which is her family's sort of hometown. And so we thought we'd sort of make this sort of skate video of Chadni. That's one idea, but then I'm also interested in recording people's like sort of neuroelectrical activity, and then somehow representing that as a landscape that people fly through their own dreams. That's another project that I have for VR. But I mean, yeah, it's just like a really fantastic like space to experiment in. But also, I mean, I also report back to painting. Whatever I do in VR, I'm also interested in somehow being inspired by traditional media. I don't want to just get sucked into VR. In fact, it's probably already happened. It's really good to be at the beach and feeling some real sun, but most often than not, I'm stuck in a head-mounted display in a room, being very lonely, and organising my ideas in silence. Yeah.
We've talked before about the idea of the disappearing of the frame, and the phrase that I had in a catalogue essay that got edited out, which was shattering Alberti's window.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Tell me what you think about what that actually does, like that entering of the pictorial space in VR.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I think that the window is shuttered in that kind of Albertian logic, that we don't have a kind of reference to other images within the framed image because there isn't any frame. You're actually in a completely immersive environment, or even if you see it as an image, the image just is now surrounding you from every angle. So I mean, I think on one level it changes the mechanics of actually making work, but of course it radically changes the experience of work as well. I mean, I think the one idea that's sort of, well, I'm still getting my head around, is there's no behind the scenes anymore. There's no behind the camera. Like you're behind the camera, or there's a scene behind this camera, and that's always been played out in cinema. And I love the tradition of, say, filmmaking that's tried to disrupt that idea, like a kind of materialist, structuralist thinking around how cinema operates. But now we have got a different challenge. If we want to try and pull apart the logic of making VR or 360 video, we can't so easily just get behind the camera. Being behind the camera is actually a temporal thing rather than a spatial thing.
Yeah.
You're behind the camera once the recording's over. But also experiencing work, I think that it's also interesting to think of that there may not be a kind of privileged position to view from, that people edit the experience with their bodies. And if they choose to experience 360 from a perspective that isn't, say, what the director wants or is hoping for, intends to be the kind of privileged position within 360, then that's great. People can look at, say, more abstract details within the 360 experience, or they can get kind of lost looking at a kind of banal detail and miss whatever the privileged action is, but that has to be a legitimate way of experiencing 360, because it's just like the world. It's like if you don't want to look at the stage, you'd rather look at the crowd, or you'd rather look at the security or some other detail within, say, a concert. It's not a proscenium stage scenario anymore. The proscenium's the stage, or all you see is the stage, or whichever way you want to look at it. It's a radical kind of rethinking of presentation, I think.
To me, it seems like it's a logical extension of using the two screens, which you've done quite a bit of over the years. I think particularly of the stereo sequences exhibition that you had, which I think was 2011.
Yeah.
And a lot of those were kind of opposing screens. It's almost like that space that closes in.
Yeah. I think I was always trying to get that experience where the viewer would edit the work for themselves, or they would have to make some decisions that would be the decisions that an editor would make, and they'd have to do it with their body in space. And that's just offered as a part of the medium now in VR. It's not like I would have to set two screens in an opposing sort of fashion, but you're already seeing it in the round just by putting the headset on. So for me, it kind of resolves a few problems, well, not just some issues that I was working on with works like double field viewfinder, or the entire sort of stereo sequences project. I was definitely moving towards that work before having a chance to actually look at VR. Even though it was around in 2011, it just wasn't accessible to me. I just didn't have access to the technology. Yeah. Only through a kind of Hollywood sort of thinking about VR. Yeah. So, but I also think that that AR is also interesting now as well, because I've already well and truly sort of entered VR as a kind of experimental space in a very humble way, but I would like now to look at, say, technology like, say, the HoloLens, and so people still have a reference to their immediate environment. They can still see where they are, but I would be inserting objects or sequences or experiences within their what they're still registering as their space.
So AR is augmented reality, is it?
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. I'm just getting lost in like acronyms, technical acronyms that I hardly know myself. But the AR space is also, for me, a very interesting and dynamic space, because I feel like VR is problematic because it completely arrests your senses, and the idea that it's a kind of prison in that sense it's a pretty apt metaphor. But AR is maybe even more insidious in the sense that you still feel like you're in your immediate environment, yet that environment has been manipulated to a very high degree with the technology, which for me is fascinating. Yeah. Anyway.
Tell me a little bit about you're part of a collective called Bad Faith that is working in this area. Tell me a little bit about the collective and how that is generating new work.
I sort of thought about being a part of like a network of people, because we're still exploring the medium and we all need a bit of help. Well, I do, at least. And so the collective seemed like it was a really good environment to work in. And we're not really under any sort of delusion that we're based on an avant-garde model or anything. It's just more of a kind of technical and a creative sort of workshop or little network. But we were really tough on finding the right name, because we are still very fashion conscious and we needed that right image management. So we came up with Bad Faith because of the reference to Jean-Paul Sartre and his notion of bad faith as this kind of inauthentic sort of movement. But we also like the fact that it sounded like a 70s rock band, and it can oscillate between the two somewhere. But yeah, it was just an attempt to get some people together to share ideas and knowledge, but also there's a practical side to it where we have some very experienced producers within that collective. So a work for me like Orbital Vanitas wouldn't be possible because I'm pretty disorganized and I don't know any animators. It's not really part of my creative palette, but I was networked into some incredible animators through that collective. It was pretty amazing because I didn't know that technical community at all. Even on a with cinematographers, I didn't really know who was out there shooting different kinds of VR. Yeah. And if I was doing it for myself, I would have maybe done it in a completely different way. But it was great just to talk to cinematographers for the first two projects and work with them in this collective environment, and then also the animators for the last work, Orbital Vanitas. But also it's not an unusual thing for VR to have collectives. We're just one collective amongst many others, and we feel like it's back to the 80s for me, because it's like I used to be a part of like a graffiti crew or a breakdancing crew, and it feels like a real 80s moment for me. So I just recently went to Los Angeles to attend VR LA with my VR crew to battle another VR crew in LA, which was called Venn Agency. Yeah. And I was kind of like one of the artists representing my crew, and Blontron is the kind of the lead artist of Venn Agency. Her name's Samantha Matthews, but she goes by Blontron. So it was actually like a very 80s kind of. We should have wore headbands, I guess. I think it's a quite an exciting moment, because you've obviously got a number of different people wanting to kind of, the technology has like opened up this space, and then now people kind of running into that space going, wow, what can we actually do with this thing that is going beyond
the kind of the short promotional kind of videos where, which is spectacular, but,
Yeah.
kind of shallow in a way.
Yeah, and also I think people can really smell branded content like rats. We really see where the commercial world has already not infiltrated VR, but they've led VR. So big industry has been the kind of vehicle in which VR has become now a consumer experience. HTC out of Taiwan, which is responsible for the Vive system, they're a huge corporation. Samsung is enormous, with their kind of hardware, or Zuckerberg buying Oculus for $2 billion a few years ago. So already I understand that my reception of VR is through that kind of scale of economy. And it's not like we started with SciGraph or one of these smaller organizations in computer labs or university departments. We're sort of grabbing VR at a moment where it was affordable and accessible to us through huge, multinational businesses selling it to us. And so this is the kind of moment for us to make our experimental work by hijacking and using that hardware, but staying away from branded content. Or if it is branded, it's always going to be a Robin Hood scenario where we pump that back into more experimental work. Because it is expensive just at the minute. We'll probably laugh in 10 years' time thinking, oh wow, it was so difficult, so expensive, but that's the reality of virtual reality at the moment.
With the Sundance, with the premiere of this work, Orbital Vanitas at Sundance, what does that mean then, do you think, for how VR will be received, I think particularly within Australia? You've been an Australian artist.
I mean, it's actually just, I'm actually just following an already sort of well-worn path actually, because Lynette Woolworth, who's an incredible Australian artist and filmmaker, she already premiered her incredible work Collisions at Sundance last year, and that was actually it's an incredible work. I don't need to talk about her work for her. She's just incredible. But because she premiered that work at Sundance, and Sundance has already become one of the kind of known spaces for VR, supporting it in their program, but also commissioning work, which her work was a part of that commissioning, sort of that commission series. In fact, I think it was their first large-scale commission, and so that's a huge, I guess, a privilege for her. But also, it shows me what's possible through Sundance. Like I already put Sundance on my radar because of Lynette Woolworth, but also because of another artist who's been working through that particular festival, this guy called Chris Milk, who developed, he founded an organization called Verse, and VerseWorks was his production company, which then extended through massive amounts of venture capital and investment. Now it's called Within, and Chris's work has always been influential, even if I'm kicking against it, because he comes from a commercial filmmaking background, and his work is very baroque and detailed, and but it's also something that I've been interested in because of the mass public reception of that work. It's very appealing work, very influential work within the very early stages of consumer VR, and it's festivals like Sundance or South by Southwest or TIFF that have these experimental sides to their programs that really get that work to audiences. And then there's a kind of secondary distribution from those works, like the New York Times OpDocs, which has been a very influential sort of platform for getting VR to the public. And so I'm not doing anything new. I'm just looking at people like Chris Milk and incredible Australian artists like Lynette Woolworth, and following in their footsteps.
And finally, get on your skateboard.
you want to see some accidents? I could do.
Come on, bleed for us.
I could do one.
Bleed for your public.
I'll do one, man. I'll do one. Seriously, I'll do a 360. I'll do a really
Okay.
hard. I'll do a really hard one 360. Is that all right?
Yeah, yeah.
I'll put myself under enormous pressure to get it right. Sorry, man. I didn't really see it. I'll do a better 360 for you, and then that's it. Oh, just
Okay.
a standard 360. That was really pathetic. If any skateboarders saw that, they're just like, they wouldn't even give me any old man points.
Hey!